Hi, students. In this lecture, I want to talk about, in this short 10-minute lecture, I want to talk about two key concepts in yoga philosophy that we commonly associate with the Yoga Sutras, but which are a part of a larger philosophy we call Samkhya, which is laid out in a text from about the 4th century of the Common Era called the Samkhya Karika. Samkhya is a base philosophy for much of the material that we see in the yoga tradition before Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, which we date to about, say, the 3rd century of the Common Era. A lot of debate about it, maybe 1st century Common Era. It definitely came together over a long period of time. But Samkhya describes the kind of parts of the material world, material and the non-material world, in terms of the tattvas, and we'll talk more about the tattvas later, which are kind of the different pieces of the world's elements. Tattvas is kind of another word for elements. And Samkhya's philosophy is it's a philosophy of ontology. It's a philosophy of the structure of the universe, the way it is, the way it is put together. And it, as it's described in the Karika and other later writings that give it a rather full form, it's taking material from the Upanishads, which were these group of 13 texts or so, 13 or so texts, depending on who you talk to. Some people say this is an Upanishad, some people say this is not, and are part of the Sruti tradition, the mainline tradition of a scriptural discussion in yoga from about 800 years before the Common Era at the earliest. Some people put it as recent as 500 years before the Common Era, into about Maitreya Upanishad to about 200 of the Common Era. That long period is where the Upanishads were made, and before that there was the 4 Vedic texts, which go back to about 1500 years before the Common Era. All of that material has reference to Samkhya philosophy, and the two main evolutes or elements, they're not really properly evolutes, one of them is an evolute, aspects, we should say, of reality from this dualistic philosophy. It's not a non-dualistic philosophy, it's dualistic, and I think it's very helpful in that way, is the two pieces are Purusha and Prakriti. So Prakriti, the first action or the initial action. Kriti means action. Kriti, like karma. And pra means before in this case, or initial or primary. And then Purusha, the other term, is of course not action or manifestation, which is the high consequence of action, but it is non-action. It is being itself. It is consciousness itself. So we have these two basic aspects to reality, and they are eternal. So one of the things that you're reading in this course is this brief little excerpt from Paul Edwards' writing about the infinite regress. And this relates to kind of the particle theory of matter as seen from the yogic perspective. But what I want to point to in this lecture is that it points to the infinitude of the universe. We often throw around this word infinity, but in a way, to paraphrase a book about God, our idea of infinity is too small. We don't think that time is truly infinite, or that space is truly infinite, that there are an infinite number of universes, that there are an infinite number of moments that are born from each action that we take, that infinite is truly an infinite. But this is what we garner from the yoga tradition, that the universe is truly infinite. It's infinite in its manifestations, it's infinite in its number of universes, and it's infinite in time because it transcends time. It's beyond time. Time only begins to happen when we have space. Space and time are two sides of a coin, and we really can't, as human beings, think beyond time. We can experience timelessness, but we can't really think beyond time because the apparatus of the mind thinks in dualistic terms. It's locked in space and time, so it can't really think beyond time. It's locked in those two primary dimensions. But this is what the tradition of Samkhya suggests to us, is that Purusha and Prakriti are timeless, that the infinite regress is one of constant evolute, constant Prakriti, constant things, constant materials, constant stuff coming out of nothingness. And as we see in the in modern physics, we know, and I showed you from some of the videos that we looked at in the course, that empty space is not truly empty space. It's constantly tessellating with the appearance of matter and the disappearance of matter. And this is key to the broader philosophies of cosmology, of the nature of the universe in the yoga tradition, but specifically when we look at Purusha and Prakriti, it's helpful because we see that Samkhya gives us this absolute nothingness and this absolute somethingness, which is Prakriti, Purusha and Prakriti. And it's easy to see the world in those terms. We need empty space to have the stuff of Prakriti. We can't have one without the other. And it's not like either came first. Did nothingness come first or did somethingness come first? No, they were always eternal. And Edwards kind of refers to this in his idea of the eternal regress, that causes go back. There is no first cause like God or something like that, that causes go back infinitely. There was always stuff. There was always the absence of stuff. So this is not only a useful set of ideas to explain much of what we encounter in reality, but it's also a useful set of ideas for what we encounter in the experience of meditation. Because meditation is meant to it's meant to introvert our consciousness and take us away from this material world, the spinning of the mind, which is provoked. It's like the outside world shoots off billiard balls of thought in our mind. This work of meditation is to pull us into that infinite sphere of Purusha, and it's often spoken about that way in the meditative text, that we're integrating, we're starting to have a relationship where we're starting to identify with, we're starting to see ourselves as the Purusha. We're starting to see ourselves as consciousness. We're switching this idea of identity, which in and of itself is an evolute. Identity is kind of a generic term, the process to create identity. Right, we're latching that idea of identity to this idea of emptiness. So that is part of the specific meditative practice of the Yoga Sutras, and we'll see that more as we look at that text. But it leans on this cosmological view, a kind of epistemological view, to use these fancy terms again, a view of how we know things, leans on an ontology, and that makes it very consistent, interiorly consistent with itself, and reliable in terms of its analysis of both the structure of things that we see and then the structure of mind, which is responsible for categorizing that, making sense of that, giving that a rational structure. The Purusha is something that we seek through meditation. We're naturally in Prakriti. We're naturally spun around by the world. Very few people are naturally deeply introverted, separated from the interface with reality. We tend to especially in the Western context, especially in America, we tend to interface with reality. It's difficult to pull ourselves back or to see anything as valid, which is purely sunk in nothingness, in the witness consciousness itself, and merely the act of seeing. It's hard to legitimize that. But by setting up the world in terms of Purusha on the one hand and Prakriti on the other, and saying that those are primary aspects of the duality of the universe, and we'll look at non-dual philosophies at another point in this course, it helps us to understand the meditative process. I'm slipping into the Purusha, and to see how the universe is structured, that Prakriti is energized by the spaciousness of space, by sitting in space. Because within space, another kind of yogic saying, where there's space, prana enters in. Where there is space, energy enters in. And the work of Hatha Yoga, as well as the work of Raja Yoga, the work of mental yoga, Raja Yoga, and Hatha Yoga, the yoga of the body, is to create space. We feel that even at the grossest level. I'm creating space in my limbs by stretching. I'm creating space in my day by opening up my consciousness. I'm beginning to see into events and the space between events and not be reactive, not close up that space of reactivity, but open it up. I'm creating space in mind as well as space in body. Through the act of meditation, I'm moving towards Purusha. Thanks for listening.